Hi, my name is Rebecca Thompson Hitt. I'm the founder and executive director of the Consciously Parenting Project, and this is the Consciously Parenting Podcast. We're going to be talking with parenting visionaries, professionals, and parents to guide you and inspire you to be the most connected parent you can be. Today, I'm going to tell you the story of why I gave up punishment. I'm going to talk a little bit about shifting from punishing, which is what we all grew up with, to doing something different. It doesn't mean that our kids are just going to go crazy and they can do whatever they want. Sometimes it means that there are consequences. But what I'm talking about today is about maintaining your connection with your kids when there needs to be a change in behavior. Sometimes that change in behavior needs to be yours. So I knew before I became a parent that I wanted to be connected to my kids. I think we all set out in parenting with that intention. I had read attachment research by John Bowlby before I became pregnant, and I knew how important attachment was to mediate the stressors of life. And we're going to be talking more about attachment in an upcoming podcast episode with Tracy Castles. And then I actually became a parent. I saw pretty quickly that a very small person could totally throw me off balance and leave me feeling totally confused about life in general, and certainly about my life choices to become a parent. I needed to teach him what was appropriate. That was obvious. And the tools in my tool belt were things like punishment, consequences, and inflicting pain or separation in some way. They're the tools that most of us have from our childhoods. And they're the tools that are most talked about in our culture. And when you don't do them in our culture, you're shamed by other parents and even random strangers because that's what you're supposed to do. But what was punishment anyway? Merriam-Webster, I had to look it up, defines it as A, to pose a penalty on for a fault, offense, or violation. B, to inflict a penalty for the commission of an offense in retribution or retaliation. These do not sound like happy parenting words. To deal with roughly or harshly, or to inflict injury on, hurt. I didn't want to hurt my child. I didn't want to deal with him harshly. I didn't think it would help him in the long term. I knew when I was punished in any way when I was growing up that any behavior change came from a place of fear. Avoiding more pain. I wanted my children to do the right thing because it was the right thing, not because they were afraid. I wanted to do it. I wanted them to make those choices so that we would stay in connection. I didn't want to smack my son's hand when he hit me. I wanted to respond in a way that taught him and modeled for him the way I wanted him to handle those upsets and frustrations. But in that moment, I honestly had no idea how to do it. What I didn't understand at the time was that when my son was doing things that I would normally think he needed to be punished, he was dysregulated. He wasn't in his thinking brain, even though sometimes it looked like it. And he needed help to regulate himself or calm his body and his nervous system. Maybe you can relate to this scenario. Your child's playing on the iPad. It's time to stop. This transition all by itself is difficult for some children. They don't turn it off. Instead, they start yelling or throwing things or hitting you. Maybe it's never happened to you. I don't know. This is the part where if it does, autopilot usually takes over. And when we treat our kids the way we were treated or what we observed when we were growing up, this is normally where we punish. Maybe you yell and take away the iPad forcefully. Maybe you use threats and say that if they don't turn off the iPad and hand it to you right this minute, that they won't be able to use it for the next week. Or separation is used. Go to your room, you're in timeout. And don't get me wrong, sometimes we all need a moment, but is separation the best way to handle it? Sometimes it works better than the alternatives where you hit or scream, but does it help your child to learn better behaviors? And what does that do to the relationship? How does it feel for you when you threaten or you yell? And how does it feel for your child? I remember when my son was about 4 years old, he was out of control and I felt really powerless and helpless. It was a situation much like the one I started off explaining, except it was a television. That's how long ago it was. We didn't have iPads yet. Every time we went to turn off the television, he would completely melt down. I wanted to punish him. I wanted to put him in timeout to punish him for flipping out. So I drug him, screaming and kicking across the house, and put him into his room. Maybe you've done this too. But my son didn't just go in and sit on his bed and think about what he'd done. I'm not sure if I thought that that was what was going to happen, but he was on the other side of the door, trying to pry it open while I was on the other side of the door trying to hold it closed. The door swung open for just a moment, and I caught a glimpse of his face and his eyes. And I could see that he was scared. I could see that he was terrified. And I knew that this is the wrong thing for me in that instant. It's the wrong thing for him. This is the wrong thing for our relationship. But I couldn't stop there. You can't just stop. What kind of message does that send? But I stopped anyway. And he came flying into me and onto my lap, and we both cried together. It took me several years to figure out that he was having his own experience from an earlier loss of his younger brother. I wrote about this in my first book, if you haven't read that story. He was upset, not just about the TV going off, but about a lot of things. And being a little kid, he didn't have the resources, the wherewithal, the connection, the neural pathways that he connected that he could say, Mom, I'm having a really hard time. I really need some help. And honestly, it doesn't matter what the story was. My son needed help regulating. He needed help with the transition. He needed help. And I was not helping. I was making it worse. I was taking away the only thing that he had, which was his relationship with me. That was how he learns to regulate. That was his lifeline. And when I put him into his room, I took away his lifeline. But I didn't understand at that time. I didn't know. So I didn't understand at the time that those moments were the moments he was expressing how he was feeling. It was the moment of the last straw, and all of the emotions came tumbling out. So it wasn't just about the television going off. It was about everything. So then now, as I reflect, I wonder, was I punishing him to stop the expression of his feelings? Was I punishing him so that he would learn something? What would that be? That he can't have a temper tantrum when it's time to turn off the television? Maybe. And then is this how learning really happens? Which was a big question for me. So right here, I want to acknowledge what Scott Noel calls the gap. It's the space between the way you want to parent and see yourself handling things and the way you're actually able to handle them with the tools and resources you have available to you. How much sleep you got last night, how much stress you've got going on at work or with your family or with your partner. I lived in the gap for a really long time. The space between how you want to parent and how you actually do is very painful. I like to talk about the continuum of consciously parenting. I wrote about it in my last newsletter, and that's unconscious incompetence is where we begin, and we don't know what we don't know. And then we move to conscious incompetence, where now we're aware. This is the worst part. We're aware that we want to parent differently or we want to do something differently. We can't do it yet. We don't have the skills. We don't have the support. We don't have the resources. Then when we can finally move out of that place, and some people are like, oh my God, hallelujah. But it's still work. But you're able to do it the way that you want to do it. You have to think about it. It's an arduous kind of process, but you can do it. And then you finally, this is what I really love to point out, you finally get to this place. This is the place that I am most of the time now, and that's unconscious competence. And unconscious competence is now, it's become your new habit. This is just what you do. My child is upset, and I look at what's happening and I focus on regulation. I focus on my own regulation and I focus on their regulation. And then I deal with whatever it is after that. And it's not that I don't ever do anything, but because I do. There are times where there are consequences, but that's not punishment. They're different. They're very, very different. So it takes identifying why you want to do something differently and connecting with your heart, not just your head. So in the story I shared about my son, there was the moment when I connected with my heart and I knew that this wasn't what I wanted to do. Making a change requires some kind of heart connection. That may be your own childhood experience that you don't want to repeat. It may be something you watch someone else go through that you connect with the pain of it and know it's not for you. Could be a friend you're watching parent and just standing back and looking at it and saying, oh no, I don't want that. But it takes a heart connection to change. It takes your heart and it takes your head. And for me, once I got to that point, it still took me 4 years to get to the place where I knew what to do and I could even be in conscious competence some of the time. So my process doesn't have to be your process, but that's what it was for me. So after 4 really hard years of trying to figure all this out and finally getting the support that I needed to be able to do it, this is what I learned. Real learning happens when we're regulated. Real change happens when we can see our choices and do something different. Real change doesn't happen when we're in survival and on red or in our fight, flight, or freeze. We can't change there. The power is in helping everyone to learn to regulate. When everyone is regulated, learning can happen. And regulation happens in connection, not in isolation. And so much of what we hear in our culture about timeout is all about, well, you've got to send them away so that they can learn and they can, get their act together. And in reality, our children learn to regulate through connection. And we are interrelated, interdependent beings. We need each other on a physiological level to help regulate. So there is real power in helping everybody to learn to regulate. That's when change happens. And when everyone is regulated, learning can happen. And regulation happens in connection. So I learned to focus on regulation. Mine first, always mine first, and theirs. I learned to create space for their feelings and expression of those feelings. And yes, sometimes there were consequences, like when my child was flipping out every single time that we have to turn off the iPad, television, or the computer. They're not able to handle it. So we do something different. It might mean that we put the computer away for a while or that we try different things to help. But the emphasis here, going back to punishment, is that punishment is not about helping. It's about hurting. It's about inflicting pain. It's about retaliation. And those are things that I do not want to be part of my parenting. When I'm parenting from a place of love and connection, my goal is learning. My goal is regulation, so my child can learn from that place of connection. Now, can I always do this? Took me years, but now most of the time I can. Sometimes things do trigger me, and then I can't. I need space and support, just like you do, when I end up there in that place. But it is my intention to maintain connection. It is my intention to focus on regulation. And if I can't, then I know that there's something going on for me. So focus on moving in the direction that you'd like to go and figure out what your next step is to shift away from punishment if this is what you decide to do for you. If you grew up with punishment, it's a big transition to do it another way. So go gently. Look for supporting resources, people, and community so that you don't feel alone. That's how I made the shift. Not by myself, not in my room all by myself. God, how much I would love to have time by myself when my kids were little. It wasn't by myself. It was in community. It was in connection. And it was finding the right people and support to make it happen. So before I go, I want to make sure that you know about a layer of support that's available to you for free. So I have a new learning center and community, and there are free resources available with the free membership. We're having a sale right now on the gold level memberships. which include all the support we have, all of our content and video calls with our community members. And that's all about helping you to find your own way. It's a reflective process that we use. It's a specific format so that you can find your own answers. So thank you for listening, and we'll connect with you next week. Let me know what you think about this episode. If you like it, please share it. What we need to change the world is community and connection and sharing resources that help us to get there. So if you enjoyed this conversation and you want to share it with your friends, please do. Talk to you next week. You've been listening to the Consciously Parenting podcast with Rebecca Thompson Hitt. For more information, visit our website, consciouslyparenting.com.